Krista Dittmeyer was a young mother, a woman who fought every day for her 14-month-old daughter. Life had been hard on her, but she kept pushing forward, balancing the demands of being a mother with the difficulties of survival. On the evening of April 23, 2011, she made an unexpected trip to the Cranmore Mountain Ski Resort in Conway, New Hampshire, a place that seemed harmless at first glance. Little did anyone know, this trip would mark the beginning of a chilling mystery that would haunt her family forever. Krista's car was found parked in the lot at the base of the mountain, still running, the headlights piercing the night. Inside the car, her daughter sat strapped in her seat, perfectly unharmed, but Krista was nowhere to be found. The scene didn't seem to make sense. Why would a young mother leave her child alone in a running car? Why would she disappear without a trace? And where was she? The night air was still. The clock ticked, the chill in the air grew deeper, and the clock began its inevitable countdown. It was as if Krista had vanished into thin air. Her daughter, safe but alone, was the only sign that something had gone wrong. No signs of struggle, no missing belongings, just the unsettling emptiness of the parking lot. The authorities were alerted immediately. A search began, but the vastness of the area, combined with the unnerving absence of clues, made the investigation difficult. The police initially thought maybe Krista had wandered off, or maybe something had happened to her on a hike, but nothing fit. No one had seen her. No one had heard anything. Hours turned into a day, then two. Yet no sign of Krista emerged. The investigators started to entertain more disturbing possibilities. What if she hadn't simply wandered off? What if something else was at play here? Who would harm a mother so young? As they began to piece together her life, disturbing details started surfacing. Krista had always been close to her family, but she had a complicated history. Her relationship with Anthony Papile, her ex-boyfriend and the father of her child, had been strained for a long time. Their breakup had been messy, full of emotional turmoil and unspoken animosities. Papile, known for his short temper and erratic behavior, became the first person of interest in the case, but there was no immediate evidence linking him to Krista's disappearance. The investigators found themselves at a dead end. The more they dug into her background, the more complicated the situation became. Krista had been involved in shady activities, drugs, deals, and an underworld that she had tried to leave behind. It was becoming clear that her life had been anything but ordinary. Was her disappearance connected to her past? Then a call came in. The police had managed to track Krista's phone records. The calls were disturbing. Several days before she disappeared, Krista had been in contact with someone who had sent her threatening messages. Someone from her past, someone she trusted. The authorities began to realize the situation was much darker than they had originally thought. But just when they thought they were close to unraveling the truth, a new twist occurred. A passerby came forward with information that would change everything. The witness described seeing a man near Krista's car the night she vanished. But the figure in question wasn't Papile. This new lead opened up more questions than answers. The investigation took a more sinister turn. Someone else had been involved. Someone who had been lurking in the shadows. Someone who had kept their distance but was now the key to understanding what happened to Krista. The mystery was far from over. The cold, silent night in Conway, New Hampshire, was just the beginning. The news of Krista Dittmeyer's disappearance spread like wildfire across the small town of Conway, New Hampshire. Her family, in utter shock, could hardly comprehend that Krista was gone. Her mother, frantic with worry, couldn't help but replay the events in her mind, questioning what had gone wrong. She had known Krista to be independent, but this wasn't like her. Local authorities sprang into action. Teams of officers, volunteers, and search dogs flooded the area surrounding the Cranmore Mountain Ski Resort. Yet despite their tireless efforts, Krista remained elusive. The vast snowy terrain proved to be a challenge, and every hour that passed without a clue felt like a hammer falling on the hearts of those who loved her. It wasn't long before something unexpected was discovered. Krista's car, still running, was found in the parking lot with the headlights on. But where was she? There was no sign of her near the vehicle, no personal items scattered about, nothing to suggest a struggle had taken place. Only her daughter, a small baby girl strapped in her seat, remained untouched. The child, however, appeared calm, an eerie contrast to the growing chaos. The mystery deepened when the police questioned Krista's ex-boyfriend, Anthony Papile. Known for his fiery temper and turbulent relationship with Krista, he quickly became a person of interest. Papile had always been in and out of Krista's life, often creating emotional turmoil. Yet, his whereabouts were unclear, and he seemed oddly detached when questioned. The authorities couldn't immediately find any solid evidence linking him to Krista's disappearance. His alibi checked out, but his lack of concern raised eyebrows. As the days passed, it became clear to the investigators that there was more to Krista's disappearance than simply a missing persons case. Something felt off, deeper, more sinister. Krista had lived a life far from ordinary. Unbeknownst to most, she had been caught in a dangerous world of drug dealing, trying to juggle the pressures of motherhood and a broken relationship with Papile. Her association with unsavory characters and questionable business dealings painted a darker picture. But how far did it go? Had Krista made enemies in that world? The breakthrough came when a local witness reported seeing a strange man near Krista's car the night she vanished. The man was seen leaving the area, and crucially, he wasn't Papile. This new lead threw the investigation in an entirely new direction. Who was this mysterious figure, and what was his connection to Krista? Suddenly, the investigation took on a new urgency. The police began combing through Krista's phone records, hoping to trace her final communications. What they found was startling. Krista had received a string of threatening messages just hours before her disappearance, the language unmistakably tense and ominous. What could have happened to escalate her situation so quickly? The nature of the messages indicated that Krista was in immediate danger, but who was behind the threats? The investigators quickly realized that the list of people who could have posed a danger to Krista was growing. Her troubled relationship with Papile, her connections to the criminal underworld, and now this new mystery figure all pointed towards something darker than they had initially imagined. Was this a simple case of a young woman trying to escape her past? Or was she the victim of a carefully planned conspiracy? But as the investigation pushed forward, there was still so much they didn't know. Was Krista's disappearance connected to her past dealings, or was there something even more insidious at play? Each new piece of the puzzle raised more questions than answers. The pressure to find Krista, and the truth, was mounting. With the clock ticking, the police knew they had to act fast. Every hour that passed without a clue made it more difficult to piece together the truth. The haunting question hung in the air. Where was Krista Dittmeyer, and who was responsible for her vanishing act? The search for Krista Dittmeyer had entered its fourth day. Hope was beginning to wane, and the frustration was palpable. The authorities, the volunteers, and Krista's family had combed through every inch of the area around Cranmore Mountain, but there was still no sign of her. The unsettling feeling that something more sinister was at play lingered in the air. The searchers had become weary, but they pressed on, not willing to give up on Krista. Then, everything changed. A phone call came through. A local hiker had spotted something near a nearby water reservoir. The search team immediately changed direction, gathering their things and heading toward the tip. The hiker described seeing something in the water, something that didn't belong. The drive was tense, the anticipation heavy. When they arrived, the sight of the water reservoir stretched out before them, cold and uninviting. The officers waited cautiously to the edge, and within moments, the somber discovery was made. Krista's body was found submerged, just out of sight beneath the water's surface. The cold of the water had preserved her for days, but the evidence of violence was clear. This wasn't an accidental drowning. Krista had been murdered. A wave of shock swept over the investigators. They had feared the worst, but now they knew for certain. Krista Dittmeyer had been taken, tortured, and dumped into the cold water to die. The question now was, who did this to her? The autopsy confirmed what the investigators feared. Krista's cause of death was not simply drowning, but a brutal assault. Her body showed clear signs of trauma, bruising, and blunt force injuries. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that she had been killed violently. The cold water had concealed the true nature of her death, and it was only now, upon finding her body, that the full extent of the crime could be understood. As the news of Krista's body being found spread, the grief and disbelief hit her family hard. Her mother, in particular, was inconsolable. She couldn't understand why anyone would want to harm her daughter, a young mother who had only ever tried to do what was best for her child. Krista's daughter, left behind in the car the night Krista disappeared, had now lost her mother forever. The emotional toll on Krista's family, especially her young child, was immeasurable. But amidst the sorrow, the investigators quickly shifted gears. The discovery of Krista's body meant they now had a crucial piece of evidence, and they would need to use it to unravel the mystery of who had killed her and why. This wasn't just a case of a missing person gone wrong. It was a calculated, cold-blooded murder, and there was still much to uncover. The first clue came when the police discovered Krista's belongings near the scene, including her cell phone. A quick review of her phone records revealed something chilling. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Krista had been in contact with someone who had been trying to get in touch with her. But who and why? The messages Krista received on her phone were disturbing. They were filled with threats, warning her to stop whatever she was involved in. Krista had been trying to distance herself from her past, but someone, or perhaps several people, didn't want her to leave the world she had been part of. Was this about money, drugs, or something far more personal? The phone records pointed to a disturbing possibility. One name kept coming up: Anthony Papile, Krista's ex-boyfriend, the father of her child, and a man known for his violent tendencies. But the police couldn't jump to conclusions yet. Papile wasn't the only one in Krista's life who might have had a reason to harm her. The team dove deeper into Krista's history, trying to connect the dots. They uncovered her ties to the local drug trade, which only made things more complicated. Krista had been trying to get out of that world, but her connections ran deep. She had made deals, and in that world, betrayal and violence were often the consequences. But who had she crossed, and who stood to gain from her death? Then another unexpected clue came to light. A local resident, a friend of Krista's, came forward with information that had been overlooked in the early stages of the investigation. Krista had been meeting with someone the night she disappeared, someone who had given her a ride. The details of this meeting were vague, but it was clear that this person knew something. But who were they? And why hadn't they come forward sooner? The investigation had taken a darker turn. The discovery of Krista's body was just the beginning. As the detectives pieced together the clues, they began to realize that the truth was even more complicated than they had initially believed. Krista's life was more intertwined with dangerous people and secrets than anyone had anticipated. The murder wasn't just random. It was part of a much larger, more complicated picture. And the detectives were only just beginning to uncover it. With the clock ticking, they had to keep pushing forward. They had a victim. They had a phone. They had clues. But the killer was still out there, and time was running out to catch them. The news of Krista Dittmeyer's death hit her family with a force that left them numb. Her mother, devastated by the loss, struggled to find words, unable to comprehend why someone would do this to her daughter. Krista, a young woman who had fought so hard to build a life for her daughter, was now gone. The grief was overwhelming, but the shock was compounded by the realization that Krista's death wasn't an accident. She had been murdered, and the authorities still didn't know who was responsible. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to piece together fragments of Krista's life that revealed a woman caught between two worlds. On one hand, she was a loving mother, trying to do right by her 14-month-old daughter. On the other, she was tangled in a web of drug deals, betrayal, and a past she had hoped to escape. The investigators learned that Krista had been trying to get out of this dangerous world. She had started distancing herself from the people she once knew, but it was too late. The shadows of her past were closing in. The focus of the investigation turned to Anthony Papile, Krista's ex-boyfriend, and the father of her child. Their relationship had been volatile, filled with arguments and emotional turmoil. Papile's temper was well known, and Krista had often confided in friends about how controlling and angry he had become. But despite his history, the authorities had no solid evidence to link him to Krista's death, at least not yet. It was clear that Krista's life had been a complicated one. She had tried to be a good mother, but the pressures of raising a child on her own while battling the darker aspects of her life had taken a toll. She had dabbled in the drug trade, but her decision to leave it behind wasn't enough to protect her. Krista had become entangled in a dangerous game, and someone had decided that she knew too much. Someone wanted her gone. In the days following Krista's death, the police uncovered disturbing details about her life. She had been in contact with people who were involved in illegal activities, people who didn't take kindly to betrayal. Investigators started to piece together the events leading up to her death, but the full picture was still unclear. They knew Krista had been trying to leave that world, but what had really happened in those final days? Then came the breakthrough. Krista's cell phone records revealed a troubling series of calls and messages leading up to her disappearance. They found that Krista had been speaking to someone she had been avoiding, Trevor Ferguson, an associate of Papile's. Ferguson was a man with his own criminal ties, and Krista's recent conversations with him had been tense. The investigators dug deeper into Ferguson's background and uncovered a connection to Krista that they hadn't fully realized. He had been a constant presence in her life, even when she tried to sever ties with him. Ferguson's involvement raised new questions. Had he been in on the plan to silence Krista? Was he working with Papile? And if so, what role did he play in Krista's death? The investigators knew they had to bring him in for questioning, but the deeper they dug, the more complex the case became. As the investigators worked tirelessly to connect the dots, Krista's family continued to struggle with the devastating reality. Her mother had hoped that Krista would someday escape the chaos and build a better life for herself and her daughter. But now, all of that hope had been shattered. Krista's daughter, left behind without her mother, was a constant reminder of the cost of the violence that had taken Krista's life. The investigation wasn't just about finding out who killed Krista. It was also about understanding how someone could fall into such a dark world and end up paying the ultimate price for trying to escape it. Krista had been a victim of more than just the crime that killed her. She had been a victim of the choices she had made and the people she had trusted. But who were those people? And who had finally turned on her? The search for answers was far from over. Every lead brought more questions than answers. The case was far from resolved, and with every passing day, the pressure mounted to find the killer. Krista's family was desperate for justice, but would they ever get it? Would they ever know who truly killed Krista, and why? As the investigation deepened, the truth about Krista Dittmeyer's life began to emerge in pieces, each more unsettling than the last. The police had always suspected that her disappearance was connected to the dark world she had once been part of. But now, with Krista's tragic death, it was becoming painfully clear that her involvement in the criminal underworld was far deeper and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Krista had tried to distance herself from that world, to escape the dangerous relationships and risky business she had gotten involved in. But the deeper the investigators dug, the more they found evidence that Krista had never fully left it behind. As they sifted through phone records, social media messages, and witness statements, they discovered a tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and dangerous connections that had followed her throughout her life. One of the first people the investigators focused on was Trevor Ferguson, a known associate of Anthony Papile, Krista's ex-boyfriend. Ferguson had been close to Krista at various points, and his connection to her wasn't as innocent as it seemed. Witnesses revealed that Krista had recently been in contact with Ferguson, and the nature of their conversations raised suspicions. It appeared that Krista was caught between trying to get out of the criminal life she had been living and people who weren't going to let her leave so easily. In one shocking revelation, the police learned that Krista had been planning to confront Ferguson and Papile about money she had earned through illicit deals. Krista had kept a portion of the earnings, intending to keep them for herself and her daughter, but it seemed that both men believed they were entitled to it. Krista's attempts to distance herself from this dangerous world had led to her being targeted by those who didn't want her to get away. The detectives now realized that her murder was not simply a crime of passion, but rather a calculated move to silence her and take back what she had earned. As the investigation continued, the police uncovered more about the toxic relationship between Krista and Papile. Despite their tumultuous breakup, the two had remained in contact, and it was clear that their relationship was far from amicable. Papile's anger toward Krista had been building for months. She had refused to return to him, and that refusal seemed to have triggered something in him. But was it just about the money, or was there something more personal at play? Krista's former friends began to come forward, revealing even more about her complicated life. They spoke of how Krista had been under constant pressure from Papile, who would frequently show up uninvited, demanding money and making threats. The emotional abuse she had endured at his hands was worse than anyone had realized. Those who had known her closely were shocked to find out the extent of the control Papile had over her, even after their breakup. She had been trapped in a cycle of fear and manipulation, unable to break free from the grip of someone who had once promised to love her. But it wasn't just Papile who had a claim on her life. Ferguson's role was more disturbing than initially thought. The police uncovered evidence that he had been helping Papile track Krista's movements and even acted as a go-between in their disputes. The more the investigators learned about Ferguson's involvement, the clearer it became that Krista's death wasn't an accident. She had been targeted by people she had trusted, and her death was the result of a planned effort to control her and reclaim what they believed was theirs. As the authorities began to piece together these disturbing facts, they realized that they were not just dealing with a murder case. They were facing a web of lies, deceit, and manipulation that had ensnared Krista. The brutal truth was that Krista had been a victim of not only the people who had taken her life, but also the life she had lived. Her association with Papile and Ferguson had been the catalyst for her demise. And as the evidence mounted, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. But there were still questions left unanswered. Who else was involved? Was there more to this story than the investigators had uncovered so far? What had Krista known? And why had she been killed? The answers were elusive, but each new piece of evidence brought the investigators closer to uncovering the full truth behind Krista Dittmeyer's tragic fate. The investigation was far from over, but with each passing day, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The detectives were getting closer, and with every new revelation, the truth about Krista's death became clearer, though no less heartbreaking. The investigation into Krista Dittmeyer's murder had reached a boiling point, but one crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing. Anthony Papile, Krista's volatile ex-boyfriend. He had always been a person of interest, but despite his angry outbursts and complicated relationship with Krista, there was no direct evidence linking him to her death. His whereabouts had been unclear for a while, and investigators could only speculate. But that was about to change. Papile's return to the area after weeks of silence sent a ripple of tension through the community. He had been absent, leaving the authorities to dig deeper into his past, his connections, and his possible role in Krista's tragic death. Now, with his unexpected reappearance, the case was about to take another, more intense turn. The investigators were already aware of Papile's violent tendencies. His previous relationship with Krista had been full of outbursts and toxic cycles, leaving Krista terrified and broken. She had tried to leave him multiple times, but Papile's possessive nature seemed to follow her wherever she went. Despite their breakup, Krista had remained in contact with him, and the investigators had already uncovered unsettling phone records showing that Papile had been calling Krista shortly before she vanished. But now, with his return, Papile's behavior began to raise more red flags. He seemed overly calm, even when faced with the news of Krista's death. His indifference made the investigators uneasy. Why wasn't he more upset? Was he hiding something? Papile's statements during his questioning only deepened the suspicion around him. He claimed he hadn't seen Krista for months, but his answers were vague and inconsistent. His alibis didn't add up, and the authorities began to wonder if he had been lying from the very start. As the investigation zeroed in on Papile, his behavior became more erratic. At times he would appear nervous, avoiding certain questions, while at other moments he seemed unnervingly calm, as if the situation didn't faze him. This was a man who had once been close to Krista, the father of her child. But now, he was acting like someone hiding a dark secret. His refusal to cooperate with the police raised more questions than answers. Then came the breakthrough. A forensic examination of Papile's phone revealed troubling details. The investigators discovered several calls and messages between Papile and Trevor Ferguson, the man who had become the second major suspect in Krista's murder. Ferguson, who had been seen near the scene on the night Krista disappeared, had a long history with Papile. The two had been involved in a series of illicit activities together, and their connection was becoming clearer with every new discovery. The phone records painted a disturbing picture. It wasn't just about Krista's death, it was about something much bigger, a conspiracy between Papile, Ferguson, and potentially others, to silence Krista and reclaim what they believed was owed to them. The murder wasn't random. It was premeditated, and the motive appeared to be rooted in greed, betrayal, and revenge. The investigators now had the evidence they needed to confront Papile. They were ready to bring him in for questioning. But before they could act, something unexpected happened. Papile disappeared again. He went silent, vanishing as suddenly as he had reappeared. It was as if he knew the walls were closing in, and he had no intention of facing the consequences. The police were left scrambling, unsure of his whereabouts. Could he have been tipped off by Ferguson or someone else in their circle? Had Papile gone into hiding, or was he planning something more sinister? The questions were endless, and the clock was ticking. In the days that followed, The pressure mounted. The investigators knew that they couldn't afford to let Papile slip away again. They had to act fast. Every new lead pointed to a man who was willing to do anything to avoid taking responsibility for his actions. A man who had betrayed the mother of his child and now stood at the center of a web of lies and deception. Papile's return had changed everything. The investigation was no longer about a missing person. It was now a race against time to bring a killer to justice. The deeper the detectives dug, the clearer it became that they were dealing with a man who was far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. And as the walls closed in, one question remained. Would they be able to find him before he disappeared again? Or worse, before he silenced anyone else? With Anthony Papile's disappearance, the investigation into Krista Dittmeyer's murder seemed to have stalled. The search for him intensified, but every lead seemed to fade into nothing. Papile had vanished once again, and the authorities were left grasping at straws. His ties to Christa were undeniable, but the case needed more than just his name to connect the dots. The pressure was mounting, and the investigators knew they had to push harder. Then, one crucial detail emerged: the discovery of Michael Patelis, an associate of Papile and Ferguson, who had slipped under the radar until now. Patelis was a man with connections, but unlike Papile, he kept his distance. He wasn't as easily traced or as prone to explosive outbursts. But as the investigators dug deeper into his background, they found a chilling pattern of involvement in similar criminal activities. Patelis had a history of handling the logistics of illegal transactions, a perfect fit for someone in the shadow of the main players. The breakthrough came when Patelis was linked to a storage unit rented under a false name. Inside the unit were several boxes of items, some of which appeared to be from Christa's personal belongings. The investigators were stunned. What were Christa's things doing there? Could this be evidence that the murder was not just about a financial dispute, but something far more sinister? The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Patelis wasn't just a passive bystander. He was active in the plot against Christa. As the investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the area around the storage unit, they found a crucial clue: a man identified as Patelis, visiting the unit several days after Christa's disappearance. What was he doing there? The investigators now had reason to believe that Patelis had been involved in both the planning and execution of Christa's murder. But the story didn't end there. As the authorities continued their investigation, they uncovered more startling evidence. It turned out that Patelis, in collaboration with Papile and Ferguson, had been monitoring Christa's movements long before the murder. They had been tracking her to ensure she wouldn't escape the dangerous world she had once been a part of. The investigators discovered that Christa had planned to confront Papile about money and her past dealings. Her attempt to regain control over her life had made her a target. In one final twist, a piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source: Christa's daughter. Although the child was too young to speak, the authorities had never fully understood the significance of her presence in the car when Christa disappeared. Christa's daughter, it turned out, had been the key to the entire investigation. When her mother was taken from her, it triggered a sequence of events that led to the uncovering of a much larger conspiracy. The child's survival in the car had provided a critical link, a reminder that the criminals had underestimated the consequences of their actions. The motive behind Christa's murder was becoming clear. It was no longer just about money. It was about control, about Christa's defiance, and about the lengths to which Papile, Ferguson, and Patelis were willing to go to keep their criminal empire intact. The investigators were now able to connect all the dots: the phone calls, the surveillance footage, the storage unit, and the testimony from those closest to Christa. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. The authorities were closing in on the culprits. Papile and his associates had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated how far Christa was willing to go to free herself from their grip. And now, as the investigation moved forward, the full extent of the conspiracy would be revealed. As the investigation took its next steps, the tension in the community grew. The families of those involved braced for the truth to come to light. But the deeper the authorities dug, the more complex the story became. This was no longer just a case of murder. It was a reflection of the darkest corners of human nature: greed, betrayal, and the manipulation of power. The authorities had one last goal: to bring justice to Krista Dittmeyer and her daughter. They had uncovered the key players, the plot, and the reasons behind her tragic fate. But would they be able to catch those responsible before it was too late? Just when it seemed the investigation into Krista Dittmeyer's murder had reached a deadlock, an unexpected turn of events emerged. A crucial piece of information, one that had been sitting just beneath the surface, finally came to light, and it came from someone no one had anticipated. It was a small, quiet voice, a local resident, someone who had lived in the area for years but had kept to the shadows. This person had heard rumors about the crime, but had kept silent for weeks. But after seeing the toll the case had taken on Krista's family and the desperation of the authorities, they couldn't remain silent any longer. They had witnessed something crucial the night Krista had disappeared. The witness, whose identity the police chose to keep confidential for the time being, had been walking home near the area where Krista's car had been found abandoned. They had seen a man near the car, but this wasn't Papile, and it wasn't Ferguson either. It was someone else, someone unfamiliar to the witness, but who had been acting strangely. This man had been talking to Krista, seemingly in a hurried, tense exchange. The witness had recognized him as a man from the underworld, someone involved in shady dealings but not a direct link to Krista or her immediate circle. This new information was a breakthrough. The investigators hadn't been looking at this individual before, and now, with the witness's account, they could see a new avenue of the case unfolding. The man, who was later identified as Derek Moore, had connections to a variety of criminal enterprises but had kept his distance from the core group involved with Krista. However, what he knew about Krista's activities could be the key to understanding why she was targeted. Moore's sudden involvement, however, raised more questions. Why had he been talking to Krista on that fateful night? Was he a part of the plot to silence her? Did he have something to gain by keeping her in the dark world she had been trying to escape? The authorities moved quickly. Derek Moore was brought in for questioning. He initially denied any involvement, but the more the investigators pressed him, the more details he revealed. He admitted that he had been working with Ferguson and Papile, albeit in a more peripheral role. Moore's role in the murder was more about making sure Krista stayed in line and didn't expose the dangerous activities she had been wrapped up in. The investigators pieced together that Moore had been one of the people responsible for keeping tabs on Krista, making sure she didn't leave the criminal world. He wasn't as deeply involved in the planning of the murder as Papile or Ferguson, but his role was pivotal in enabling the conspiracy. Krista's attempt to take control of her life had posed a direct threat to the plans of those who were still tied to her past, and Moore was part of the chain of people who were prepared to stop her. Despite his own admission, Moore seemed to be trying to downplay his involvement. He claimed that he didn't know it would escalate to murder, that it had all gone too far too quickly. But the investigators weren't convinced. They saw him as a key player who had now become the weak link in the chain. What made this breakthrough even more significant was the new insight it gave the authorities into Krista's life. She hadn't been alone in her struggle to escape the underworld. There were forces at play, watching her every move and pushing her back into the life she was trying to escape. The investigators began to understand just how difficult it had been for Krista to break free. Every step she had taken to distance herself from this world had been thwarted by the very people she had once trusted. But the revelations didn't stop there. Moore's involvement in Krista's death pointed to an even darker side of the case. It wasn't just about drugs or money. It was about control. Krista's defiance, her attempt to regain some autonomy over her life, had threatened the status quo. The web of criminal connections that surrounded her wasn't just opportunistic. It was a carefully orchestrated system of manipulation and fear. The unexpected help from the witness, combined with Moore's confession, suddenly put the pieces together. The authorities now had the names, the motives, and the connections they needed to build a solid case against Papile, Ferguson, and their associates. But even with this new information, there was still much work to be done. Could they bring everyone involved to justice, or would they fall short? The investigators now knew that they were not just dealing with a simple murder case. They were uncovering a much larger conspiracy that involved power, fear, and the exploitation of a young woman who had tried to escape her past. Krista Dittmeyer had been a victim not just of violence, but of a system that had kept her trapped, a system that was now beginning to unravel. With each new revelation, the authorities drew closer to the truth. But time was running out, and the clock was ticking. Derek Moore's confession had given them hope, but the true challenge lay in bringing the entire network down. The investigation was far from over, but at least now they were armed with the knowledge they needed to finish what they had started. As the investigation into Krista Dittmeyer's murder unfolded, a sense of betrayal began to loom over the case. The deeper the authorities dug, the more they uncovered not just about the crime, but about the people Krista had trusted the most. What had begun as a missing persons case had morphed into a dark web of manipulation, lies, and backstabbing, and the ultimate betrayal was yet to be fully revealed. Krista's closest friends and family were left reeling as they learned just how deep the betrayal ran. Her ex-boyfriend Anthony Papile had always been a central figure in her life, but it wasn't just the violence or the controlling behavior that had driven Krista to her breaking point. What hurt even more was the realization that Papile, someone who had once promised to love her, had become the very reason for her demise. His motivations, driven by a combination of greed, jealousy, and control, had led him to manipulate, betray, and ultimately end her life. But Krista wasn't just betrayed by Papile. She had also been betrayed by someone she considered a friend, Trevor Ferguson. Ferguson had been in and out of Krista's life, but it wasn't until after her death that investigators pieced together the full extent of his involvement. Ferguson had been more than just a passive bystander. He had worked with Papile, keeping tabs on Krista, making sure she couldn't escape the dangerous world they both had a stake in. But the most shocking detail came when the police learned about Ferguson's secret relationship with Krista, one that had gone unnoticed by those around her. Krista had trusted Ferguson, more than she had trusted anyone else in her life. They had shared intimate conversations, and Krista had confided in him about her struggles to break free from the criminal life she had been part of. But, as it turned out, Ferguson had been playing both sides, using Krista's vulnerability to manipulate her. He had been a willing participant in the plans to keep her in the dangerous world she was trying to escape from. The betrayal cut deeper when the investigators uncovered that Ferguson had been present in the days leading up to Krista's murder. He had helped orchestrate the brutal robbery that led to her death, all while pretending to be her friend. The web of lies had been spun so tightly that it was difficult for Krista to see the truth, that the very people she had trusted were the ones who had ultimately taken her life. Krista's mother, overwhelmed with grief, was left to reconcile the painful truth about the people Krista had surrounded herself with. The shock of discovering that Ferguson had not only betrayed her daughter, but had been directly involved in her death, was almost too much to bear. How could someone so close to Krista, someone she had relied on, have turned on her so completely? The sense of betrayal wasn't just a personal wound. It was a betrayal that spanned far beyond Krista's death and reached into the very fabric of her relationships. As the case against Ferguson and Papile built, the family was forced to confront the darkest parts of Krista's life, the parts that had led to her untimely death. The betrayal by Ferguson was not just a breach of trust. It was a deliberate, calculated act to ensure that Krista's life and her attempts at escape would be crushed. The investigation into Ferguson's involvement revealed a disturbing pattern. He had been the one who had encouraged Krista to meet with Papile, the very meeting that ultimately led to her being attacked and killed. The manipulation was shocking. Ferguson had used his proximity to Krista to make her believe that he cared about her well-being, all while plotting her demise alongside Papile. But the betrayal didn't end there. As the case progressed, the investigators found evidence that Ferguson had been attempting to flee the area. He had been planning to leave, perhaps fearing that his role in Krista's murder would soon come to light. The authorities, now determined to bring him to justice, knew that they couldn't let him slip through their fingers, but with Ferguson's sudden disappearance, the clock was ticking. The case had taken a devastating turn. What was once a tragic death had now become a story of calculated betrayal, manipulation, and murder. The web of lies spun by Ferguson and Papile had entangled not only Krista but also the lives of everyone who had known her. As the investigation pushed forward, the authorities began to piece together the full extent of the betrayal, a betrayal that would forever change the lives of Krista's family and the community around her. In the end, the investigators knew that the case was more than just about finding out who killed Krista. It was about exposing the darkness in the hearts of those who had been closest to her, and ultimately ensuring that justice was served, no matter how painful the truth would be. The investigation into Krista Dittmeyer's murder had been making steady progress. The authorities had gathered overwhelming evidence against Anthony Papile and Trevor Ferguson, but there was still one missing piece that eluded them: the full story. The truth seemed within reach, But the detectives knew that the case wasn't over until all the pieces were in place. Then just when it appeared that the case was winding down, an unexpected twist turned everything on its head. A new piece of evidence came to light, one that had been hidden in plain sight. A phone call recorded just days before Krista's death was uncovered, and it raised questions that no one had anticipated. The recording wasn't of Krista herself, but rather a conversation between Michael Patelis, an associate of Papile and Ferguson, and someone unknown. The conversation, which had initially seemed insignificant, was now the key to unraveling the conspiracy. In the call, Patelis was heard speaking urgently about the plan to silence Krista before she could reveal something she had learned. The words were chilling, but what struck the investigators was the reference to someone else, someone who had not yet been identified as part of the plot. This revelation took the investigation in an entirely new direction. The police had already thought they had all the players involved, but now it was clear that there was another person behind the scenes, someone who had been operating in the shadows, manipulating things from afar. The pieces began to shift, and the detectives realized that they had been looking in the wrong direction all along. The next clue came when a local informant, someone familiar with the criminal world that had ensnared Krista, came forward with a tip. The informant revealed that there had been a third party who had been paying close attention to Krista's attempts to escape the underworld. This person was someone who had been watching Krista for months, ensuring that she wouldn't break free from the grip of those who wanted to control her. They were a silent observer, pulling strings without ever being noticed. The identity of this third party was eventually uncovered: Derek Moore, the man who had been seen near Krista's car the night she disappeared. Moore had been the one to feed information to Ferguson and Papile, ensuring that Krista's attempts to leave the criminal world would be thwarted. His role had been critical in orchestrating the events that led to Krista's murder. But it wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about Krista's betrayal. It was about control, about a web of influence that stretched across the criminal underworld, a web that Moore had been trying to maintain at all costs. The twist wasn't just in the discovery of Moore's involvement. What shocked the investigators was the extent to which he had gone to cover his tracks. Moore had been working for someone else, someone even higher up in the criminal hierarchy. This person, it turned out, had been the ultimate puppet master, the one who had orchestrated the entire plot to keep Krista under control. The investigators were stunned by this new development. They had assumed that the case was about the actions of a few individuals, Papile, Ferguson, and Patelis, but now it was clear that they were just pawns in a much larger game. The mastermind behind Krista's murder was someone much more powerful and elusive, someone who had been operating under the radar, staying one step ahead of the authorities at every turn. With Moore's involvement now revealed, the investigation took on a new urgency. The authorities had to track down the true mastermind, the person who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. But as they dug deeper, they realized that the case had far-reaching implications. This wasn't just about Krista anymore. It was about a network of criminals who had been manipulating people for years, people like Krista who had become victims of a system that preyed on their vulnerability. The unexpected twist left the investigators with more questions than answers. Who was the true mastermind behind Krista's murder? What did they stand to gain from silencing her? And how far did their influence reach? As the authorities closed in on their target, the tension continued to build. The twists kept coming, each one leading them closer to the truth, but also deeper into the dangerous web that had been woven around Krista's life. Every new revelation brought with it a sense of urgency, but also the sobering realization that the fight for justice was far from over. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and the final confrontation was still to come. The road to justice was long, and the truth, though within reach, was still shrouded in mystery. But one thing was certain: the authorities were closer than ever to uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy that had claimed Krista's life. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the weight of the truth was finally becoming clear. Krista Dittmeyer's murder was not a random act of violence. It was the culmination of a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. As the authorities prepared for the final confrontation, the pressure to bring the culprits to justice was immense. This wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about unmasking a criminal network that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. The investigation had revealed a network of people tied to Krista's death. Anthony Papile, her abusive ex-boyfriend, Trevor Ferguson, the manipulative accomplice, and Michael Patelis, a key player in the conspiracy. But there was one more person, the mastermind behind the plot, whose identity had eluded the investigators until now. As the final days of the investigation approached, the authorities closed in on Derek Moore, a man whose involvement had seemed peripheral at first, but whose role turned out to be far more significant than anyone had realized. Moore had been the link between all the players involved, feeding information to Papile and Ferguson, ensuring Christa remained under their control. But Moore wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger scheme that had been operating for years, a web of criminal activity that spanned far beyond Christa. The authorities knew that they needed to act quickly. They had gathered enough evidence to tie Moore to the conspiracy, but the final confrontation was going to be the hardest part. Moore had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks, and the police knew that he would do anything to avoid capture. But this time, the tables had turned. With everything now laid bare, the investigators had the upper hand. The police moved in, surrounding Moore's last known location. The tension in the air was palpable as they prepared for the confrontation. Moore had been on the run, but he couldn't hide forever. The walls were closing in, and the inevitable confrontation was about to take place. When Moore was finally apprehended, the authorities found him surprisingly calm. He had expected this day to come, but he was ready to face the consequences of his actions. The calmness in his demeanor contrasted sharply with the violence he had helped orchestrate. As he was brought in for questioning, Moore's cold indifference to the murder of Christa shocked the investigators. He had been a key player in her death, yet he showed no remorse for his actions. It was clear that his role had been one of calculated manipulation, and he had always been willing to do whatever it took to protect his criminal network. As Moore sat in the interrogation room, the truth began to unfold. He revealed the extent of the conspiracy, shedding light on the inner workings of the criminal network he had been part of. He confirmed that the plot to silence Christa had been well organized. Papile, Ferguson, and Patelis had all played crucial roles, but Moore had been the one feeding them information, ensuring that Christa remained trapped in a life she couldn't escape. Moore's confession was a crucial turning point in the case. It tied together the scattered pieces of evidence and confirmed what the investigators had suspected all along, that Christa's murder wasn't a spontaneous act, but a deliberate and calculated decision made by people who saw her as a threat. Her attempt to break free from their grip had forced their hand. They had to stop her. But even as Moore's confession revealed the truth, it also revealed something darker, the extent to which Christa had been manipulated and betrayed by those closest to her. Papile, Ferguson, and Patelis had used her, controlled her, and ultimately killed her because she had threatened to expose their criminal activities. The betrayal Christa had experienced was heartbreaking, and it was now clear that she had never stood a chance. The investigators knew that the final confrontation was not just about capturing Moore and the others involved. It was about bringing closure to Christa's family and ensuring that justice was served. The emotional toll of the case had been immense, but the truth was finally out. The mastermind behind Christa's murder had been unmasked, and the pieces of the puzzle were now fully in place. As the authorities prepared for the trial, they knew that they had a strong case against the culprits. The evidence was overwhelming, and the truth about what had happened to Christa was now undeniable. The criminals who had once believed they could operate in the shadows were now exposed for the world to see. For Christa's family, the trial would be a painful process, but it was also a step toward justice. Christa's daughter, left without her mother, would never fully understand the horror that had taken place. But the investigators were determined to make sure that Christa's death wasn't in vain. They would make sure that those responsible for her murder would face the consequences of their actions. The final confrontation had come, and justice was within reach. But it was just the beginning of the long road to healing for those who had been left behind. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial of Anthony Papile, Trevor Ferguson, and Michael Patelis began its final stages. Krista Dittmeyer's family sat at the back, their faces etched with grief and determination. The weight of the past months had worn them down, but they had one final hope, that justice would be served and that the people responsible for Christa's death would be held accountable for their actions. The evidence against the three men was overwhelming. The testimonies from witnesses, the phone records, the surveillance footage, and the confessions had all pointed to one undeniable truth. These men had plotted Krista's murder, each playing a crucial role in her tragic death. The manipulation, the betrayal, and the violence they had unleashed had left Krista's family shattered. But now the moment of reckoning was upon them. The prosecution had laid out its case in painstaking detail. They had demonstrated how Papile, with his possessive jealousy, had driven Krista into a corner. They had shown how Ferguson had acted as a co-conspirator, helping to track Krista's every move, even as he pretended to be her friend. And they had exposed Papile, the man who had been the silent executor, helping to carry out the plan to kill Krista once it became clear that she was a threat to their criminal enterprise. But the most crucial moment came when Derek Moore, the final piece in the puzzle, took the stand. His testimony was chilling. Moore, once an accomplice in the plot, had turned on the men he had helped orchestrate the crime with. Under the pressure of the trial, Moore had finally admitted his role in the murder, confessing to his part in keeping tabs on Krista, ensuring she stayed under control. His revelation about the higher powers that had been involved shocked everyone in the courtroom. Krista's murder had not only been a personal vendetta, but part of a larger, dangerous underworld that sought to keep its grip on her. With Moore's confession, the jury had enough to convict the three men. There was no doubt left. The emotional weight of the trial had taken its toll, but Krista's family remained strong. They knew that no matter the outcome, nothing would ever bring their beloved daughter back. But seeing the men who had so coldly taken her life now facing the consequences of their actions brought them a sense of justice, a small sliver of peace amidst the pain. Papile, Ferguson, and Papile were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read aloud, the finality of the decision hanging in the air. Krista's mother, though grieving, allowed herself a moment of relief. The men who had destroyed her daughter's life had been held accountable, and justice in some small way had been served. As the judge pronounced their sentences, each man was led out of the courtroom in shackles, their faces stoic but resigned. Papile, Ferguson, and Papile had been part of a web of violence and control, and now they would face the full weight of the law. They had plotted, manipulated, and betrayed, and now they would pay the price for their actions. For Krista's family, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. It was justice, but it could never undo the damage that had been done. Krista would never come back, and her daughter would grow up without the mother she had so desperately tried to protect. But at least now the truth had been revealed, and the people responsible had been brought to justice. The trial had been a painful journey for those who loved Krista, but it had also brought the community together in a way that no one had anticipated. People who had once turned a blind eye to the underworld that Krista had been trapped in now realized the depth of the danger she had been in. And as Krista's family left the courtroom, they knew that, while justice had been served, the road to healing would be long. The case of Krista Dittmeyer had finally come to an end, but the memories of her life, her struggles, and her ultimate sacrifice would live on. Her story had shed light on the darkness that existed just beneath the surface, and in the end, it was that darkness that was defeated. Justice had been served, but the scars of the past would remain forever etched in the hearts of those who had loved Krista. What do you think of Anthony Papile's involvement in Krista Dittmeyer's tragic death? Do you believe justice was truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more true crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching.